For this episode of Scholar Talks, we will be discussing the honor, courage, and virtue of the U.S. Army in the Battle of the Chosin Reservoir during the Korean War. Our guest Steve Vogel is an author, historian, and former military correspondent for the Washington Post. His books include The Pentagon, also Through the Perilous Fight, 6 Weeks That Saved the Nation, and a task force called Faith, the untold story of the U.S. Army soldiers who fought for survival at Chosin Reservoir and honor back home, which is the topic of today's discussion. I am Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at the Bill of Rights Institute, and I want to welcome you to another episode of Scholar Talks in our America 250 series. Steve, I want to thank you very much for joining me.
No, thank you, Tony. It's an honor to be with you.
I mean, come on. Can you write a more compelling book than this? I was riveted. Every single page, just the story, the men involved, all of their great struggle during these, was it 4, 5, 6 days of battle? Just an incredible story, and you just bring it alive, almost like no other book I've read. It's an incredible book.
Well, thank you, Tony. I appreciate that. Thanks.
All right, so let's go ahead and dive in then. So who was Don Faith and the men of Task Force Faith, as you call it, and why did you want to tell their story?
Yeah, so Don Faith was an Army lieutenant colonel. We're talking about 1950, the Korean War. So we're 5 years out of World War II, and South Korea has been invaded by the North, and all of a sudden the United States is involved in a ground war in Asia. And Don Faith, Lieutenant Colonel, is in charge of a small Army task force that had been put up into North Korea, along with a larger 10th Corps force of Marines and Army soldiers and South Korean forces that were trying to drive the North Korean army back, and eventually try to destroy it and unify Korea.
Mhm.
And Task Force Faith was in those days, you often had an army task force, which could be usually maybe a regimental enforced team, RCT, uh, and they would sometimes name the task force after the commander. And Don Faith was thrust into command of this task force when, during the course of the battle, his commander, Alan McLean, was captured, and never seen again. So the reason I chose the name Task Force Faith, apart from the fact that that was sort of how it was known informally, was also just some of the faith that these men had to have in their leader, in themselves, because of the situation that they found themselves in, where they were, as you read, thrust into really one of the most harrowing and unbelievable military battles in American history. And that's a lot of people have forgotten about today. And the reason I wanted to do this story um, was, as you mentioned, I was a reporter for the Washington Post. So back at the 50th anniversary of the Korean War, I thought I knew a fair amount about military history, and I certainly was familiar with Chosin as just one of these legendary moments in Marine Corps history, because it was. The Marines were up there at Chosin Reservoir in this unbelievable cold, surrounded by a much larger Chinese force, but they managed to fight their way out. And that's where you get the famous, retreat hell. We're just attacking in a different direction. And it's just a legendary moment in Marine Corps history, and one of the proudest, and justifiably so. But I didn't really know anything about the fact that the Army had been there too. And somebody had told me about them. Hey, there was an Army unit that was up there that had kind of a different fate. And I found some of these soldiers, some of them veterans, who were living in Maryland, D.C. area, and went out and interviewed some of them. And I was just amazed at what I heard, just the harrowing battle that they went through, the terrible casualties they took, and then the fact that they were afterwards labeled as cowards because their unit, Task Force Faith, was largely destroyed. And these stories came out basically accusing them of cowardice, saying they dropped their weapons and run. They were not given the Presidential Unit Citation that the Marine Corps was given, which they had earned, of course. So I did this story back then, 25 years ago, and always thought that, I really want to write a book about these guys because this story, needs to be known. And, I finally got it done. It took me 25 years because we're now at the 75th anniversary. So I'm
Okay.
a slow worker, I guess. But yeah, it's an amazing story, and happy to talk about it with you.
Great, great. Yeah, just in time for the 75th, right? And
Yep.
and no, I think it goes a long way, if I may say so, towards rehabilitating sort of their great courage and role in the battle. So thinking about sort of the context of the war, you mentioned sort of the start of the Korean War. If you can kind of maybe provide a little bit of historical background, how did the U.S. Army find itself in the Chosin Reservoir?
Yeah, so the first 6 months of this war were just an unbelievable seesaw, dramatic swings back and forth. When the North Koreans invaded in late June in 1950, they rolled over the South Korean forces, quickly captured Seoul. Um, President Harry Truman decided pretty quickly that the United States, along with the United Nations, should intervene. And Douglas MacArthur, the great American hero from World War II, was still the Allied commander for the occupation forces in Japan. And, he sends forces in. First, he tries, naval and air power, and he tells Truman, we're going to need ground forces. So before you know it, some of the occupation army forces, four divisions that were based in Germany are being sent, I'm sorry, based in Japan are being sent into South Korea, but they're initially rolled over too. The North Koreans
Mm,
were equipped with Soviet tanks and weaponry, and they're well trained. And the American forces had been an occupation force. They weren't really on a war footing at all. A lot of their equipment was bad, and they were being pushed back to the very toenail of South Korea and
mm,
is danger of being pushed into the sea. And then MacArthur comes up with just one of the great
mm,
bold strokes that he was so fond of, where he puts together a landing force uh, that lands at Incheon near Seoul, well behind the North Korean lines. And this includes the soldiers of Task Force Faith. They're part of the 7th Division. And they, along with the 1st Marine Division, make up this force. And the Incheon succeeded beyond most people's dreams, everybody but MacArthur. And the North Korean army was suddenly in full retreat. And
mm,
the aims of the war quickly expanded. Initially it just been to let's put the border back where it was and restore the South Korean government. And by virtue of the success they were having, Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff back in Washington approved expanding the aims of the war to unify Korea, destroy the North Korean army, and that's how Task Force Faith, the 7th Division, the 1st Marine Division, which made up 10th Corps under General Ned Almond, are sent into the north, another amphibious landing, and they're starting to push up towards the Manchurian border. And Chosin Reservoir was in the highlands of North Korea, very, very rugged land, and starting to approach the Chinese border, and really with only one road in. And
mm,
uh, as the American forces are pushing north, there are warnings from China coming in saying, basically, the U.S. forces should not be in North Korea. Some warnings are issued. MacArthur pretty much ignores them, along with Truman and the Joint Chiefs. There's some concern, but they decide that, well, the Chinese aren't going to do anything big, and that proved to be wrong. And as the Army Task Force Faith was rushed up to Chosin to guard the Marines' flank, and just when that happened, the Chinese intervened in a major way. They had basically infiltrated two enormous forces into North Korea, and one of them attacks the Eighth Army to the west and quickly has that in retreat. And then the other force of 150,000 Chinese troops, some of the best they have, surround the Marines and the Army, who are on both sides of the reservoir, the small Army force on the east side and the larger Marine force on the west side. And that kind of sets the stage for the Battle of Chosin Reservoir.
Right. And what are they outnumbered? What, 10 to 1 or 12 to 1 or something like that from the
It
book?
it changes and it gets worse
Yeah.
as it gets along.
Right.
The Chinese outnumbered generally at least 5 to 6 to 1 at the start of the battle. The army forces on the east side, because they were much smaller, were outnumbered by at least 6 to 1. And then uh, as the battle continues, the Chinese decide to devote more force to trying to destroy the army. And so by the latter part of the battle, the last 2 days, nights, they're outnumbered 9 to 1. Just unbelievable odds. Uh, and they're also running out of ammunition. As I describe in the book, there's all kinds of complications that they're facing.
Right. And fighting in snow and 10, minus 20, 30, and minus 30-degree weather. I mean, it's just horrifying.
Yeah, that's one of the things that people, I think, if they stop to think about what that must have been like, essentially fighting in 20 below zero. And these guys, on both sides, I'm including the Chinese and also the South Koreans fighting alongside the Americans, were not equipped for this kind of warfare. A lot of them had, summer type uniforms. They didn't have warm sleeping bags. The Army guys, in particular, had been rushed up there so haphazardly by Ned Almond, that they hadn't had time to bring up a lot of their warm weather gear, warming tents. And these guys, not only are they freezing themselves, their weapons are freezing up. Their guns won't fire in that type of cold. Their um, their food is frozen. Their water is frozen. The water in their canteens is frozen. So these guys are fighting without any types of sustenance. They are, uh, when you think about Valley Forge or the Battle of the Bulge, which were some of the, most horrendous conditions, cold conditions that American forces have ever faced. This was even worse. The cold was even greater there. And yeah, they paid a price. Everybody did. A lot of soldiers, Americans, Chinese, and Koreans froze to death, Marines
Mhm.
as well.
Right, right. Well, in that vein, so you describe in just amazingly vivid detail, just the 4 or 5 days of some of the most relentless, most harrowing fighting against Chinese forces, and then a fighting breakout and retreat, or at least the other way. Can you give the viewers a sense of the intense fighting they endured and how they survived it? I mean, I'm going to encourage our viewer. You have to read the book, but can you just give us some sense of the fighting that happened?
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Chinese army. This is a force that had just a year earlier, completed the Chinese Civil War, and Mao's People's Republic of China had just been in place for about a year at this point. So these guys are hardened fighters. They've been fighting the Civil War for 17 years, and their commanders were very skilled, and they had tried and true techniques where they would attack an enemy head on, but then would send another force behind around the enemy force to cut them off. They were really expert at that. They were also expert night fighters, so they were almost exclusively attacking at Chosin at night. Not entirely, but mostly at night, because the Americans had air power. Marine Corsairs were flying close air support, and it was very close on both sides of the reservoir. They provided a lot for the American forces. So it was um, at the same time, the combat was unbelievably close, particularly at night, because the Chinese would try to infiltrate through the American lines, and then they would send, people sometimes use the term human wave attacks. This isn't really what was going on. It wasn't just, a bunch of people suddenly rushing forward. They would send more like a battering column of men at one point, a point, maybe between two companies or point they'd identified as being weak for whatever reason, and try to break through the line and just relentlessly attack. And they suffered terrible casualties doing that, but their manpower advantage was so great that they could often succeed in breaking through, and that caused a lot of chaos and casualties and confusion, friendly fire, everything, because this is a lot is happening at night, and you know they're not uh, they're not using lights or fires or anything like that because they don't want to give away their position. So it's a real terrifying experience for soldiers on all sides of it. And as mentioned earlier, they are also running low on ammunition. The Americans had a really great weapon, defensive weapon, that was anti-aircraft guns, which
Yeah.
they weren't using for against aircraft. They were actually using them against the attacking Chinese, and they were really terribly effective. But they were running low on that type of ammunition, and there's so much chaos going on in their communications. We should mention were extremely bad, both
Mm.
radios within the American excuse me the American units, as well as with very little communication with higher headquarters. And so they are running low on ammunition. They need more of these 40 millimeter shells for the anti-aircraft weapons, but
Mm.
the those shells, when they're dropped, are dropped somewhere else where some American Army tanks were, and vice versa. So they're not getting the right stuff. They don't get the ammunition they need. They're also running out of small arms weapons and ammunitions. You name it, they were running out of even maybe one of the most horrible things was the medical supplies.
Mm.
They A medical convoy had been ambushed by the Chinese on its way up to join with Task Force Faith, and their medical supplies, because of the number of casualties they were suffering, were almost entirely exhausted. Really, the doctors, the medics were just using anything they could to try to treat these wounds, but there were a lot of soldiers who bled or froze to death because of the conditions. It was just a terrible situation.
Yeah, it's just chilling, but such an important read in the book. So you mentioned this a bit. So digging in a little bit more. So at times it seemed like the higher ups did not really know what was going on the ground. And later the Marines seemed to get all the credit, and then Task Force Faith was sort of discredited, as you mentioned. Can you talk about why some of these controversies happened?
Yeah, and a lot of it was that lack of communication, and part of it was, the historic rivalry between the Army and the Marines. There was already kind of bad blood between them. You know, General O.P. Smith, commander of the First Marine Division, um, he really resented being under Army General Ned Almond, the commander of 10th Corps, and they were, Almond was trying to drive them forward, and Smith was a much more cautious commander who wanted to make sure that he had his supply lines secure, his enough ammunition on hand, which proved to be invaluable in saving the Marines at Chosin, by the way. And Almond was a lot less cautious than that, and he wanted to, do more of the Patton-like, just attacks across the country. And that type of terrain in North Korea didn't really lend itself to that. And in fact, the tanks that the Americans had, weren't able to reach them because of that terrain and the slippery, icy roads in the mountains. They weren't able to get far enough to help. So
Mhm.
that communication led to sort of an ignorance of what Task Force Faith had been facing, in terms of both the numbers of troops that they were facing, the conditions that they were fighting in. And then, you know, as the breakout ends in disaster on the Army side, the Marines down at the southern tip of Chosin Reservoir at Hagaru, they just see these stragglers coming in terrible condition, and 90% plus of the Army officers had been killed or captured. So there were very few people who could tell them, what the heck happened to you guys, what was going on. And so, there were these rumors that, oh well, the officers abandoned them and just drove back to safety in the jeeps, which was ridiculous. There wasn't a single vehicle that got out of from the east side of the reservoir, and that this Navy chaplain who was with the Marines. There were these stories that, oh, the soldiers are feigning injuries so they can get evacuated on planes. There, a lot of stuff that, where sometimes there might have been a colonel, I'm not, of course, there were some soldiers who collapsed and did anything they could to get out. But I mean, it kind of, that overshadowed the heroism that the great majority of these men showed. Um, the Marine Corps story becomes very quickly the stuff of legend, just because of, you had the correspondents who were able to join them at Hagaru and, accompanied them on this fighting retreat out. And, the Marines, the 1st Marine Division, it was one of the great performances of any military unit in American history. And that you contrast that with, the remains of the Army Task Force, who were much worse shape. And so there's soon, like, there's a movie, Hollywood is making a movie about the Marines within a month of after the battle. It's called Retreat Hell. And, the Army guys are sort of shunted aside. And then this Navy chaplain makes these public accusations of cowardice. And this was carried in newspapers and magazines around the country. And, those guys had suffered such terrible casualties. I mean, a lot of them, they never really had a chance to defend themselves. In many ways. So that became kind of the common narrative of Chosin, in a lot of histories that were written in subsequent years, where the Marines were heroes and the Army guys they folded. And so
Right.
that was kind of the common narrative.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but contrarily, final question: how did the soldiers of Task Force Faith demonstrate honor and courage and virtue during this battle of the Chosin Reservoir during the Korean War?
There were so many individual acts of heroism
Mhm.
that mostly unrecorded, because so many of them, we're talking 85% casualties, a lot of them were taken prisoner, um, that most of them went unrecorded, but there were so many um, acts that I was able to find, just from witness accounts of soldiers sacrificing themselves to rescue a wounded buddy, to try to drag people to safety once they'd been overrun by the Chinese. Um, Soldiers who were fighting for their buddy, they did feel like they'd been abandoned by the fourth night, because in many ways they had been.
Mhm.
And yet they continued to fight as long as humanly possible. They I think some of the things they did in trying to prevent the Chinese from destroying the convoy of 600 wounded soldiers that the rest of the soldiers were trying to get out, where they just, ran up Hill 1221 in the face of, heavy Chinese fire, up the snow, soldiers all around them being shot and killed, but still going forward. I mean, some of the heroism, I think one of the officers later said, the heroism was so commonplace that it almost went unnoticed. It was just
Mhm.
everybody, not everybody, but a lot of people doing whatever they could to get their buddies out, and many of them dying in the effort.
Right. Reminds me of the what is the quote? Uncommon valor was a common virtue on the
Yeah,
Newman Memorial. Yeah, absolutely. So,
very
Steve
true.
Vogel,
Very
I
true.
want to thank you very much for coming in and sharing this incredible story of courage and resilience in the Korean War as we celebrate America 250.
My pleasure. Thanks very much, Tony.
Great. And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks in the America 250 series. Please check out the other videos on our channel and click subscribe.